In the heart of the bustling metropolis, towering skyscrapers gleamed under the golden sunset, a symbol of wealth and success. Among them stood the grandest of them all, a luxurious penthouse that belonged to Philip Mensa. A man envied by many, Philip had everything anyone could dream of. Luxury cars that roared with power, a sprawling mansion equipped with the finest art, and wealth that secured him a place among the elite. Yet, as he stood on the balcony, sipping an aged whiskey from a crystal glass, a deep, gnawing emptiness consumed him. People admired his wealth, but no one truly saw him. Women flocked to him, but their eyes only sparkled at the sight of his bank account, never at his soul. Relationships were nothing but transactions, exchanges of money for fleeting affection. Dinners with associates were filled with laughter, but the moment he left, so did their interest. His success had built him a fortress, but instead of protection, it had become his prison. That evening, as he scrolled through his phone, a message popped up from his latest girlfriend, Natasha. "Let's go on a vacation, baby. Bora Bora? Dubai? Somewhere fancy. I miss you." Philip sighed. She didn't miss him, only the luxury he provided. Just like all the others. Slamming his glass on the counter, he whispered to himself, "There has to be more to life than this." Philip had never been the kind of man to sit idly by when faced with a problem. If love couldn't find him in his current world, he would go searching for it. But not as the billionaire Philip Mensa. He needed to strip himself of everything that made him desirable to gold diggers. A plan formed in his mind. What if he left it all behind? What if he became nothing? Would anyone love him then? The thought terrified him, but it also excited him. He needed answers. And the only way to get them was through experience. The next day, he met with his parents at their luxurious estate. His father, a respected politician, sat at the head of the grand dining table, while his mother, a formidable businesswoman, sipped her tea delicately. "You're going to do what?" His mother's voice was sharp, her eyes widening in disbelief. Philip took a deep breath. "I'm leaving everything behind for a while. I want to live as an ordinary man, without money, without privilege. I need to find out if love can exist without wealth." His father scoffed. "This is absurd. You're a Mensa. Our family does not play foolish games. People respect you because of your status. Do you think anyone will care about you if you have nothing?" His mother placed a concerned hand on his. "Darling, what if something happens to you? What if people mistreat you?" Philip smiled faintly. "If they do, then at least I'll know the truth." Despite their protests, Philip packed a small bag, left his lavish lifestyle behind, and set out on a journey that would change his life forever. Philip traveled far from the city, where no one would recognize him. He chose a remote village, one untouched by modern excess, where people valued community over currency. He arrived in tattered clothes, his hair unkempt, his face shadowed with exhaustion. He sat in an old wheelchair, completing his disguise as a crippled beggar. For the first time in his life, he was completely invisible. People passed him by without a second glance. A few children stared but were quickly called away by their mothers. The men at the marketplace looked at him with suspicion, and the women whispered among themselves. For days he sat on the roadside, hoping, praying that someone would acknowledge his presence. Then one evening, as the sky turned a soft shade of purple, a woman stopped before him. "Are you okay?" Her voice was warm, filled with genuine concern. Philip looked up and met her eyes. She was young, her brown skin glowing under the setting sun. She had deep, kind eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. "I..." He hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She reached into her purse and pulled out a few coins. "It's not much, but I hope it helps," she said with a gentle smile. Philip felt a lump in his throat. This was the first act of kindness he had received without the shadow of his wealth looming over him. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm Julia," she said softly before walking away. Philip watched her disappear into the crowd, his heart pounding. She was different. Julia had lived in the village her whole life. She was no stranger to hardship, yet she carried an unwavering kindness in her heart. Her father, Roland, had raised her to believe that a small act of kindness could change the world. And she lived by that principle. That night, as she prepared dinner, she couldn't stop thinking about the man on the street. Who was he? Where had he come from? "You're quiet tonight," Roland observed, setting down his cup of tea. Julia hesitated before saying, "There's a man in a wheelchair by the roadside. He looks like he has nowhere to go." Her father sighed. "It's a harsh world, child. Some people are left behind." Julia bit her lip. "No one should be left behind, Papa." The next morning, as she passed the same street, she found Philip still sitting there. She approached him again. "Do you have anywhere to go?" Philip shook his head. Julia hesitated, then made a decision. "Come with me. My father and we can help." Philip's heart pounded. He had never expected this. Someone was inviting him into their home, not out of obligation, not for money, but because they wanted to help. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar: hope. Julia guided Philip through the village, the scent of fresh bread and tilled soil filling the air. Children played in the distance, their laughter carrying through the breeze. The village was simple, but there was warmth in its simplicity. When they arrived at her home, a small but sturdy house with a thatched roof, Roland stood at the doorway, arms crossed. "Who is this?" he asked. Julia smiled gently. "Papa, this is Philip. He has no home." Roland studied Philip, his eyes filled with years of wisdom. Then, with a nod, he stepped aside. "Come in, then." Philip entered hesitantly, taking in the modest surroundings. It was nothing like his grand mansion, yet for some reason, it felt welcoming. That night, as he lay on a simple mat, staring at the ceiling, a thought crossed his mind. "This is the first time I've ever felt at home." And for the first time in his life, he fell asleep not in luxury, but in peace. The morning sun filtered through the cracks in the wooden window, casting soft golden rays over the small room where Philip lay. For the first time in years, he woke up not to the hum of city traffic, not to the mechanical voice of a personal assistant, but to the chirping of birds and the gentle clatter of kitchen utensils. He sat up slowly, feeling the unfamiliar stiffness in his back from sleeping on a simple mat. Yet, strangely, he didn't mind. From outside, the voices of Roland and Julia floated in through the open window. "Did he eat anything last night?" Roland asked, his tone laced with concern. "He ate a little," Julia replied. "He barely spoke, though." Philip had spent most of his life surrounded by luxury, yet no one had ever worried about whether he ate. The kindness of these strangers continued to baffle him. When he finally stepped out, Roland and Julia paused their conversation. "Good morning," Julia greeted with a warm smile. Philip nodded. "Good morning." Roland gestured toward the table where a simple breakfast of porridge and boiled plantains was set. "Eat. We work hard around here. A man can't work on an empty stomach." Philip hesitated. He had eaten 5-star meals prepared by world-renowned chefs, but never had a simple breakfast made by a stranger felt so significant. He took a seat and picked up a spoon. As he ate, Roland observed him carefully. "What's your story, son?" he finally asked. Philip swallowed. He had rehearsed this moment, knowing he couldn't reveal the truth. "I lost my family. The accident left me crippled. I had nowhere else to go." Roland's face softened, and Julia placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "You're safe here," she said gently. "Safe." Philip had never known what that word truly meant until now. Days turned into weeks, and Philip slowly adjusted to village life. He watched as Roland tended to the farm with weathered but strong hands. He saw Julia wake up before dawn to sell vegetables at the market, her determination unwavering. Despite the hardship, they never complained. They worked hard, but more than anything, they shared. It fascinated him. One afternoon, as Philip sat in the shade watching Julia prepare baskets of produce, a polished car rolled into the village, its foreign presence disrupting the peaceful air. A tall, well-dressed man stepped out, adjusting his sunglasses. His presence exuded wealth and arrogance. Julia's face hardened. "What are you doing here, Gideon?" she asked, her voice cool. Philip's ears perked. So this was the man who had been trying to win Julia's heart. Gideon smirked. "Why do you always sound so cold, Julia? I came to see how you're doing." His eyes flicked to Philip, who sat silently watching. "And who is this?" Julia crossed her arms. "A friend." Gideon scoffed. "A beggar, you mean? Julia, you deserve better than this village. You deserve better than a man who has nothing to offer you." Philip felt a familiar sting. He had heard these words before, but never had they hurt like this. Julia's expression didn't change. "I don't need wealth, Gideon. I need honesty. I need kindness." Gideon's smirk faltered. You're throwing your life away for nothing. Philip clenched his fists. If money is the only thing that defines a man, then maybe you're the one who has nothing. Gideon turned to Julia one last time, his pride wounded. You'll regret this. And with that, he drove away, leaving dust and tension in his wake. Philip looked at Julia, expecting anger, but she only smiled faintly. I'd rather have a poor, kind man than a rich, empty one. Philip's heart clenched. If only she knew the truth. Philip had settled into the village routine, but guilt continued to gnaw at him. He had come here seeking truth, but in doing so, he had woven a web of lies. The people he had deceived were the first to show him true kindness, and the weight of his deception grew heavier each day. One evening, after a long day of watching Roland tend the farm and Julia return from the market, Philip sat outside, listening to the sounds of crickets filling the quiet night. His mind was restless, filled with doubts and the fear of inevitable consequences. As he sat, lost in thought, he overheard hushed voices inside the house. "Are you sure about this, Roland?" an elderly villager asked. "I've made up my mind," Roland replied firmly. "Philip deserves a chance. No man should live his life feeling helpless." Philip leaned in closer, his heart pounding. What were they talking about? The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Roland called Philip to sit with him outside the house. His expression was serious, but there was an undeniable warmth in his gaze. "Philip, I want to help you walk again," he said, his voice steady. Philip froze. His mind raced. "What do you mean?" he asked, feigning confusion. Roland reached into his pocket and handed Philip a cloth pouch. It was small but heavy, filled with money. "I sold a portion of my land," Roland admitted. "There's a doctor in the city who can perform the surgery. It won't be easy, but I spoke to people who know about these things. With treatment, you might walk again." Philip felt like the ground had vanished beneath him. His throat tightened, and for the first time in years, his eyes stung with unshed tears. Roland had given up part of his livelihood, his own land, his security, his future, for a man he believed to be a helpless beggar. Philip clenched his jaw, unable to keep up the act any longer. He had to tell them the truth. The air was heavy with tension as Philip sat across from Roland and Julia inside the house. The flickering lantern light cast long shadows against the walls, mirroring the unease settling in Philip's heart. Julia looked between her father and Philip, sensing the weight of the moment. "What's wrong?" she asked softly. Philip exhaled, running a hand over his face. His disguise, his entire identity in this village, was about to crumble. "I need to tell you something," he began. "Something I should have told you from the start." Julia frowned. "Philip, you're scaring me." He looked up, meeting their expectant gazes. His heart pounded against his ribs. "I'm not crippled, and I'm not poor." The silence was suffocating. Julia blinked as if trying to process his words. "What?" Philip swallowed hard. "My name is Philip Mensa. I'm a billionaire." Roland's face turned to stone. Julia inhaled sharply. "I disguised myself to see if I could find real love," Philip continued. "I was tired of people only valuing me for my money. I wanted to know if anyone could care for me without wealth or status. That's why I came here, pretending to be someone I'm not." Julia's face twisted in confusion, then anger. "You mean to tell me that all this time, you've been lying to us?" Her voice shook. "We opened our home to you. My father sold his land for you, and this was all an experiment?" Philip's chest tightened. "It wasn't like that, Julia. I never expected any of this. I never expected to meet you, to care for you. This wasn't a game to me." Julia stepped back as if his words physically hurt her. "You let me believe you were helpless. You let me." She stopped, her voice cracking. Roland stood abruptly, his fists clenched. His usually calm, fatherly expression was gone, replaced by fury. "Get out." Philip's stomach dropped. "Roland, please." "Out." Roland's voice thundered through the small house. Philip had never felt so small, so stripped of everything that mattered. He had come seeking truth, and now that he had found it, he realized it had cost him everything. Words spread like wildfire. By morning, the entire village was buzzing with whispers. "Did you hear? The crippled beggar was a billionaire all along. He tricked us." Philip walked through the village with his head low. The warmth he had once felt from the people had turned cold. The friendly smiles had become wary glares. Mothers pulled their children away when they saw him coming. He had become an outcast. As he approached the marketplace, a familiar figure stepped forward, Gideon. The smug grin on his face made Philip's stomach churn. "Well, well," Gideon drawled. "If it isn't the great Philip Mensa, slumming it with us common folk." Philip clenched his fists, saying nothing. Gideon circled him like a predator. "You know, I have to admit, this is amusing. You came here thinking you could play poor, and now look at you." He leaned in. "Julia will never forgive you." Philip's jaw tightened. He had hurt Julia more than he could ever imagine. He had to make things right. But first, he had to face his past. He turned on his heel and walked away, determined. If Julia needed time, he would give it to her. But one thing was certain, he wasn't leaving this village without fighting for her. Philip returned to the small house he had once called home, hoping, praying, that Roland would listen to him. When he stepped onto the porch, Roland was waiting. The older man's face was unreadable. "You have a lot of nerve coming back here," Roland said, his voice dangerously calm. Philip took a deep breath. "I won't make excuses. I lied, and I regret it more than anything. But I never meant to hurt you or Julia." Roland stared at him for a long moment, then exhaled. "I gave you my trust. My daughter cared for you, and you threw it away." Philip's heart clenched. "I want to make it right. Please tell me how." Roland shook his head. "You can't buy back trust, Philip, and Julia, she's heartbroken." Philip swallowed hard. "I love her," he admitted, his voice raw. Roland studied him, searching his face. Then, to Philip's surprise, Roland sighed. "You want to prove yourself," he said. "Then start from nothing. Work for what you claim to feel." Philip nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes." And so, the billionaire who once had everything prepared to earn back the one thing money couldn't buy, love. The morning air was crisp as Philip walked to the fields where Roland worked tirelessly every day. He had never labored a day in his life. But if proving his sincerity meant starting from nothing, he was ready to do it. Roland stood near the crops, his hands covered in soil as he inspected the plants. When he saw Philip approaching, he didn't speak, only nodded toward the tools resting by the wooden fence. "If you truly want to change, prove it," Roland finally said. Philip didn't hesitate. He grabbed the hoe, his muscles tensing at the unfamiliar weight. The sun was barely rising, but the villagers were already hard at work. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he dug into the earth, his soft hands blistering with every stroke. The first day was unbearable. His body ached in ways he had never known. By noon, he felt like collapsing, but every time he looked up, Roland was watching. Julia, however, remained distant. At the market, she barely met his eyes. At home, she stayed quiet, lost in her thoughts. But Philip didn't waver. Day after day, he returned to the fields, working from sunrise to sunset. He fetched water from the well, carried heavy sacks to the marketplace, and helped repair the wooden fence around the farm. The villagers, at first skeptical, began to soften toward him. They saw his hands grow rough, his clothes covered in dirt, his determination unwavering. And then, one evening, as Philip sat outside wiping sweat from his brow, Julia finally spoke. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice quiet. He looked up, his blue eyes tired but full of honesty. "Because I love you. Because I hurt you. And I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." For the first time in weeks, Julia didn't turn away. And in that moment, Philip knew there was hope. Winning Julia's forgiveness was not as simple as confessing his love. Trust, once broken, did not heal overnight. Philip continued his work on the farm, waking up before dawn, hauling sacks of grain and tending to the crops. Roland remained strict, but there was a shift. His glares had softened into nods of acknowledgement. The villagers, once cold toward him, began offering small smiles and words of encouragement. And Julia, she was watching. One evening, as Philip sat on the porch massaging his sore hands, Julia approached with a bowl of warm water. "Your hands," she said softly, placing the bowl beside him. Philip stared at the water, then at her. Without a word, she knelt down and took his hands in hers, dipping them into the bowl, cleaning the dirt from his fingers. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Julia sighed. "Because I see you're trying." Hope flared in Philip's chest. "Does that mean you forgive me?" She hesitated before shaking her head. "Not yet, but maybe, someday." It wasn't the answer he wanted, but it was more than he had hoped for. While Philip worked to regain Julia's trust, someone else was plotting in the shadows. Anita, Julia's so-called best friend, had always harbored jealousy toward her. When she learned about Philip's wealth, her envy turned into something darker. One afternoon, as Julia helped her father at the farm, Anita approached her, her expression one of false concern. "Julia, don't you find it suspicious?" she asked, feigning innocence. Julia frowned. "Find what suspicious?" Anita crossed her arms. "Philip, he's a billionaire, yet he's still here, working like a common farmer. Do you really think a man like that will stay forever?" Julia tensed. "He's probably just pretending," Anita continued, leaning in. "One day, he'll leave, and you'll be left with nothing." The words planted a seed of doubt in Julia's mind. That evening, as Philip approached her after dinner, she was quieter than usual. Sensing something was wrong, he gently asked, "What is it?" Julia hesitated before finally voicing her fears. "Are you really going to stay, Philip, or will you leave when you get bored?" Philip's heart ached. He reached for her hands. "Julia, I would give up my wealth if it meant having you. I don't want my old life. I want you." But doubt lingered in her eyes, and Anita, watching from a distance, smirked in satisfaction. Gideon was not a man who accepted defeat easily. He had always assumed that Julia would eventually choose wealth over love. But when he heard how Philip was working on the farm like a commoner, he saw his chance to strike. One evening, he arrived at Julia's home in a sleek car, stepping out dressed in fine clothes. A large suitcase sat beside him, filled with money. Julia frowned as he approached. "What are you doing here?" Gideon smirked. "I've come to offer you what you deserve." He opened the suitcase, revealing stacks of cash. "Leave this village, Julia. Come with me. You don't have to struggle anymore. You can have everything you ever wanted." Julia's stomach churned. Philip, who had been watching from a distance, stepped forward. His clothes were dirty, his hands rough from labor. He was the complete opposite of Gideon, yet his eyes held something Gideon's never did. "Love." Gideon scoffed. "Look at him, Julia. He can't give you the life I can. He's just pretending to be someone he's not." Julia stared at the suitcase of money. Then she turned to Philip. And in that moment, she knew. She stepped forward and gently closed the suitcase, pushing it back toward Gideon. "Money means nothing without love," she said firmly. "And I'd rather be poor with the man I love than rich with a man I don't." Gideon's face twisted in anger. "You'll regret this." Julia didn't even flinch. She turned to Philip, took his hand, and smiled. And for the first time, since he arrived in the village, Philip felt something he had never known before. True love. The days following Gideon's failed attempt to win Julia's love were peaceful. For the first time, Philip felt truly at home in the village. The people, once wary of him, had slowly started to accept him again. Roland, though still cautious, no longer looked at him with disappointment, and Julia, while still healing from his deception, had let her guard down more than ever before. One afternoon, as Philip helped carry baskets to the market, he noticed Julia looking pale and unsettled. She'd been quieter than usual, and there was a hint of something unreadable in her eyes. "Julia, are you okay?" he asked, setting down the basket. She hesitated before nodding. "I'm fine, just a little tired." But Philip wasn't convinced. That evening, as they sat by the fire outside her home, she finally spoke. "Philip, I need to tell you something," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. Philip's heart pounded. "What is it?" Julia took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm pregnant." Time seemed to stop. The world around them faded into silence as Philip stared at her, his mind struggling to process the words. "Pregnant?" he echoed, his voice thick with emotion. Julia nodded, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know how you feel about this, but—" Before she could finish, Philip pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "This is the best thing that has ever happened to me," he murmured into her hair. "You've given me a reason to live, Julia, a reason to be a better man." Tears welled in her eyes as she clung to him, relief washing over her. The news spread quickly, and the villagers, once hesitant about Philip, celebrated with them. The women brought gifts, the elders gave their blessings, and Roland, though still not fully expressing his emotions, gave Philip a firm nod that spoke volumes. For the first time in his life, Philip felt something he had never known before: pure happiness. Philip had made peace with his new life, but there was still one challenge left to face: his father. It was only a matter of time before his family found out about his whereabouts. And when they did, it wasn't subtle. A convoy of luxury cars rolled into the village, their polished exteriors gleaming under the afternoon sun. The villagers stopped and watched, whispering among themselves. Philip knew who it was before he even saw them. His father stepped out first, his suit impeccable, his presence commanding. His mother followed, looking around with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Philip stood his ground as his father approached. "So this is where you've been hiding," his father said, his voice filled with disappointment. Philip straightened. "I wasn't hiding. I was living," his father scoffed. "Living? In a village? With these people?" He glanced at Julia, his expression cold. "You've disgraced our family, Philip. You were supposed to marry the governor's daughter, secure our legacy. Instead, you've thrown everything away for this?" Philip clenched his fists. "I won't let you insult Julia or this village. They gave me something that you and all your wealth never could: love, honesty, and a real home." His father's face turned red with fury. "If you don't leave with us today, you are no longer my son. You will be cut off from the family business, from the inheritance. Everything will be gone." Philip didn't even hesitate. "Then so be it." Gasps filled the air. His mother placed a hand over her heart. "Philip, think about what you're saying." But he had never been more certain in his life. "I have thought about it, and for the first time I know exactly what I want." His father stared at him, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. Then, with a final look of disgust, he turned and walked away. Philip watched as the cars drove off, feeling no regret, only freedom. He turned to Julia, who looked at him with tears in her eyes. "You chose me over everything," she whispered. Philip smiled. "I'd choose you 1,000 times over." And in that moment, he knew he had won. Not money, not power, but the only thing that truly mattered: love. Anita had always been one of the most beautiful girls in the village. She was admired for her looks, but deep inside, she carried an unquenchable desire for a luxurious life. Seeing Julia, her childhood friend, marry a billionaire made that desire even stronger. She often wondered, why her and not me? One afternoon, as she sat outside her home, contemplating her future, a man arrived in the village. His name was Leonardo. Leonardo wasn't the wealthy businessman Anita had once hoped for, but he was different from the village men. He was handsome, smooth-talking, and confident. He arrived in a shiny car, dressed in clean but modest clothes, immediately catching the attention of the villagers. In reality, however, Leonardo was not rich. He was a poor mechanic working in a garage in the city. His boss, a strict and demanding man, owned the car Leonardo had borrowed just to impress Anita. Leonardo's story was one of frustration. He had once wanted to marry a woman he loved, but because he had no money, her family rejected him. "A man without wealth is nothing," they told him. Since then, he had vowed that one day he would prove them wrong. When he met Anita, he saw not just beauty, but a woman who longed for the same things he did: a better life. He wanted to impress her, and she wanted to escape the village. Their relationship moved quickly. In just a few months, Anita fell deeply in love with Leonardo, believing he was her way out of the simple life she despised. She dreamed of moving to the city, wearing expensive clothes and living in luxury. But dreams can sometimes be deceiving. After 2 years, Anita became pregnant. She expected Leonardo to marry her and provide the lavish life he had promised. But reality was different. Leonardo was still working in the same garage, struggling to make ends meet. His boss, growing tired of his financial troubles, fired him. "I've had enough of your debts, Leonardo. Get out," the boss yelled. With no job, no money, and a child on the way, Leonardo's world collapsed. Anita, once full of hope, now faced the harsh truth. Her dream was a lie. For the next 2 years, life was unbearable. They moved from one small room to another, barely surviving. Food was scarce, and arguments became frequent. One day, as she held her son in her arms, Anita looked around their broken-down house and realized something. She was trapped. But there was still hope. One Sunday, desperate for an escape, Anita walked into a church. The church was filled with people, their voices rising in praise. Anita had never been a religious woman, but she felt a strange peace as she sat at the back, listening to the pastor. "Life is full of struggles," the pastor said, "but working for God brings peace." A good heart is more valuable than riches, and true happiness comes not from wealth, but from faith and hard work. Anita sat still, absorbing every word. For the first time in years, she felt free. After the service, she made a decision that would change everything. She picked up her phone and called Julia. When Julia answered, there was a moment of silence. Anita? Anita took a deep breath. Julia, I need to talk to you. Julia listened as Anita poured out everything, how Leonardo had lost his job, how they had suffered, and how she had finally realized that she had been chasing the wrong things. Tears filled Julia's eyes. I forgive you, Julia said softly, and I want to help you. Philip, hearing the conversation, nodded in agreement. No one deserves to suffer forever, he said. Together, Julia and Philip decided to help Anita and Leonardo get back on their feet. With Philip's connections and experience, they opened a garage for Leonardo, giving him the chance to rebuild his life. Anita, humbled by everything, also decided to change. She no longer desired luxury, but a peaceful and honest life. Slowly, things began to improve. Leonardo worked hard in his new garage, earning an honest living. For the first time, he felt like a man, not because of money, but because of responsibility. Anita, once obsessed with wealth, now found joy in simple things: her son's laughter, a warm meal, and the love of a family. Their suffering had been painful, but it had also been their greatest teacher. Years passed, and life in the village flourished. Philip and Julia visited Anita and Leonardo often, watching as they built their business and raised their son. One evening, as they all sat together outside the garage, Anita turned to Julia. I used to think money was everything, she admitted. I thought love and kindness were weaknesses, but I was wrong. You and Philip showed me that true wealth isn't in what we have, but in how we live. Philip smiled, watching Leonardo teach a young apprentice how to repair a car. We all had to learn, Philip said. I once thought wealth could bring me happiness too. But love, friendship, and faith are what truly matter. Leonardo, now a changed man, added, and hard work. I once wanted an easy life, but I've learned that a man is defined by what he builds, not by what he takes. The night was filled with laughter as their children played together, running across the courtyard. Julia leaned against Philip, whispering, This is what life is about, isn't it? Philip kissed her forehead. Yes, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. As the stars twinkled above them, a lesson had been written in all their hearts. Wealth can fade, but love, faith, and hard work will always stand the test of time. And that was the greatest treasure of all.